Well, hello and welcome to the Tolkien Podcast. I'm your host, Larry D. Curtis, or just Larry Curtis for short. And in today's episode, we are going to talk about the mysterious two blue wizards in Middle-earth. This is an often discussed topic among fans, a thing I've been asked about many times. People really want to know about these blue wizards, but Tolkien didn't write much about it. Well, today we're going to delve into what he did write about it. We're going to avoid all the online debate and just present what Tolkien presented. It's a little complicated because it's in several different sources over a long period of time. But let's start at the beginning and recap why we even know about these blue wizards. But before we get into all of that, I would be remiss if I did not thank people who are listening to the podcast literally from around the world. I don't know how someone in Asia finds the Tolkien Podcast. I don't know how somebody in Europe or Oceania, North America, South America, I don't know how people have found the Tolkien Podcast, but they have, and they've listened often more than once. We've been in 7 countries around the world, which is about the same as continents, but that's pretty cool. And I really, really appreciate it. I've asked always, and I would ask now, that if you find something of value, please just tell one other person about it. That's really the best way to help spread the word. So I make a podcast to be heard, and I'm gratified and I kind of tickled that people all over the place are finding this. In Missouri, where my mother's family is from, Ohio, Jersey, South Carolina. I don't know people there. In Queensland, in California, in South Wales. It's really fun. Dubai, Greeley, Colorado. So thanks. Really appreciate it. So in today's episode, we will talk about these mysterious wizards. Let's be clear up front that when we use wizards in the real world, we use that word. We might be talking about anyone who's good at something. The Who have a famous song called The Pinball Wizard. Not that he's a magic user with a beard and a hat, but that he's a deaf, dumb, and blind kid who's really great at pinball. So great that they call him a wizard. We use that term all the time to mean somebody who's really good or great at something, but we also use it to mean somebody who can do magic. In a film quote, a conjurer of cheap tricks. Anyone who can do something like that is kind of a wizard. But Tolkien was doing something entirely different. He was using wizard like it was an office, like it was like a calling, actually, from the creators of the world, who sent the wizards to Middle-earth with a very specific mission, which was to oppose Sauron and Melkor and kind of help the people of Middle-earth. And that's what Gandalf was doing. Now, we first meet Gandalf in The Hobbit, written in the 1930s, and Tolkien didn't yet have the Hobbit works, tied to his greater works. But Gandalf obviously is a great character, a little bit mysterious and iconic, and he was wise, of course, when he set out to write the sequel to include Gandalf. But right away in The Hobbit, I'm going to assume most people have read it or listened to it or watched it in some form, but Gandalf is traveling with 13 dwarves, and they stop in the Shire to grab a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins to be the 14th member of the party. 13's unlucky after all. And they delve off into the world, the great wide world, to try to help the dwarves reclaim their treasure. And we learn much, much later, meaning decades and decades later, that Gandalf had some other plans and other purposes up his sleeve for this trip with the dwarves. But along the way on these adventures with the dwarves and Bilbo and Gandalf, they met a great big man named Beorn, who was a shape changer and a little bit scary, actually. Gandalf, in his buttering up of Beorn and reminding or telling Beorn who he is, Beorn claims to not know who Gandalf is. So Gandalf makes a reference to another wizard that he's sure Beorn knows, named Radagast. And Beorn does in fact know him and thinks of him kindly. He's an associate of the birds and the beasts of the field. At least the beasts. I don't know if in the field is part of the book or not, or if I just made that up. But that's Radagast. So he's mentioned. So right away, well, early in The Hobbit, at least right away in that book, we know that there are other wizards in Middle-earth. We don't know what really that means, but, it can suggest, we can figure out it's a contemporary of Gandalf, somebody who maybe does some of the same types of things that Gandalf does, and we probably imagine that it's someone in the shape of an older man, perhaps bearded. Now, of course, those of you who are associated with Peter Jackson's film trilogy, that is an adaptation of the Hobbit book, you will know that Radagast's role is expanded, and he's part of what's shown in that film as the White Council. And that's clearly not in the Hobbit, but as we will see as we go through today's discussion, Tolkien did say that he was there. The Hobbit was viewed as a children's book at its publication, and I'm not sure that those children grew up and were clamoring for a sequel. It doesn't seem like the kind of work that demands a sequel. The publisher sure demanded one because they knew how popular it was, and the idea of Middle-earth certainly was popular among those readers. They were passionate about it, but I don't know that it was super logical where the story would go. It seems now to us that it is clear, but remember that Tolkien, after he published his Lord of the Rings books, kind of retrofitted subsequent versions of the Hobbit book to fit better. So readers are reintroduced to Middle-earth, reintroduced to Gandalf. They learn that this ring that Bilbo had, which seemed a fun side quest of the whole Hobbit, events around the Hobbit, now is the focus and the threat of the story, and the end of the world is at stake. So Gandalf meets up with Radagast, now met in person, referenced previously, and Radagast says there's an urgent need for him to go visit Saruman, the White Wizard, and the head of their council. Gandalf says out loud, "Hey, you're not really a guy that travels. Like, what's going on?" And so he knows it's pretty important that he go and meet with Saruman the White. Now, our purpose here is not to recount all the plot points of the Fellowship of the Ring, but Gandalf meets Saruman. Saruman is, he has some ill intentions for Middle-earth, and even invites Gandalf to join him, and thinks that the two of them can overthrow Sauron, the Dark Lord. And, of course, they'd be benevolent, kind rulers of Middle-earth. So they have some conflict. And Saruman also, in the meantime, raises an army while Gandalf's busy raising the Fellowship of the Ring and getting them off to the process of destroying the ring. Theoden, the king, and his soldiers, and then especially by work of the Ents in the forest, who decimate Sauron's army, leaving him without agents, really, in Middle-earth. So, in The Two Towers, published in 1954, the same year that the Fellowship of the Ring is published, but not at the same time, we encounter Saruman again when Gandalf brings Gimli and Legolas and King Theoden and some of Theoden's lackeys. I don't know what to call them. That's not meant to be insulting. His soldiers, I guess. And Pippin and Merry are hanging out as well. All of those people show up on Saruman's doorstep and try to, despite everything he's done, try to establish that he could still help them. And Gandalf wants to give him every chance. Now, I may not have a lot in life, but one thing I do have a lot of is editions of the Lord of the Rings books. And I have one of them handy. We're just going to read how we really learn about these blue wizards in the first place. This is in The Two Towers, in the chapter called Voice of Saruman. They're confronting this white wizard who still has these ideas, despite having no army, that he has power too, not just ideas. His voice is still a weapon, and Gandalf warns all these people, Gimli, Theoden, to beware the voice of Saruman. And they show up, and Saruman does his best to influence these very people and divide them and make them be suspicious of Gandalf, which works for a minute. And he tries to explain to Theoden that he's just a good guy, that Saruman's just a good guy, and he should make peace. He shouldn't be angry. And Theoden is angry, says, sure, we'll have peace. We'll have peace when you and all your works have perished, or when you're dead, we'll have peace. So Theoden says no. Gandalf later laughs at the wizard. When things don't go well for Saruman, Gandalf tells him, despite all that's happened, he can still be free. He can still do what he wants to do. But he is going to have to turn over his staff, or his rod, the office of a wizard, and he's going to have to turn over the keys of Orthanc. So I hope that's not too much backstory, but I think that gets us the context we need for the quote that sets up this whole idea of these blue wizards. Or at least, I don't think they're blue yet. The other wizards, these mysterious wizards. And I'm going to add a little voice work. I am not no one's paid me to act, but I think it's more fun if I do some voices. So I don't know. Don't hate on me if these aren't a measure up to, I don't know, say Andy Serkis or something. Now I'm quoting. But you will first surrender to me the key of Orthanc and your staff. They shall be pledges of your conduct, to be returned later if you merit them. Saruman's face grew livid, twisted with rage, and a red light was kindled in his eyes. He laughed wildly. Later, he cried, and his voice rose to a scream. Later? Yes, when you also have the keys of Barad-dûr itself. Sidebar, the great dark fortress of Barad-dûr. I suppose, and the crowns of 7 kings. And here is the line. And the rods of 5 wizards. And Tolkien capitalized 5 wizards to let us know they're very important. He also says Gandalf will need to buy a bigger pair of boots than he has now to fill the shoes that he's trying to replace. So Sauron says no. He's not giving away the Barad-dûr, and he can have it when Gandalf has the crown of 7 kings and the rods of all 5 wizards. So basically never. He's mocking Gandalf. Gandalf orders him back using a commanding voice, and to the astonishment of all, probably including Saruman especially, he returns out to the balcony where he was talking to the part of the fellowship. Yeah, that's what happens. Well, the bigger point, though, is despite all the interest in Saruman and what's going on, he, in this emotional moment, he's really angry. He's really, he's trying everything he can to regain his power and his foothold. He blurts out that there's 5 wizards in 1954 in the middle of the 2 towers. And for fans, that's a revelation. It's a mystery. It starts this whole thing where fans want to know what wizards? Who are you talking about? Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, to be clear, writes about later how much this was one of the many points that fans wanted to know more about. So in November of 1954, that mystery gets laid on the world, and it isn't until nearly a full year later, October 1955, that The Return of the King is published. And while we're well past we're not completely well past Saruman, he eventually, in the Scouring of the Shire, has yet another name known as Sharky. In fact, all these wizards have many, many names. Gandalf's are probably best known, but Tolkien liked to use names, so they have multiple names. Mithrandir is one of Gandalf's, or the Grey Pilgrim. But anyway, he had many names. So did Saruman, and we may get into that in a minute. Anyhow, he shows up at the end. Saruman shows up at the end of The Return of the King. Just a sidebar from our main point here. What also happens, though, in that same book, if you recall, if you've read recently, in the back of that Return of the King volume, there is the appendices written and demanded and placed there by Tolkien, and probably part of the reason all of this took longer. In that index, he talks about the White Council, which includes these wizards, not the 2 missing ones, but the ones we know. And he also places Galadriel in that council, and that means that he has effectively placed Galadriel and the White Council, which includes Radagast, into the Hobbit. While they're not printed on the page, he kind of re-engineered his legendarium to place those characters in the events of The Hobbit. He also, this adds greater emphasis that Gandalf did not want the great dragon Smaug to hook up with the Dark Lord and be united together. He wanted to avoid that. So it does make the events of The Hobbit all the more essential to Middle-earth. It does add intrigue to the Order of the Wise, and this is not the time or place to delve deeply into the White Council, but that included Círdan, who gave Gandalf his ring and who had long borne it before handing it off. Glorfindel, yes, the same Glorfindel, and Radagast. So it's Council of the Wise, basically Elrond. So the White Council is now part of the Council of the Wise is now part of the events in The Hobbit. Ties the books together. It gives Gandalf more purpose to rally the dwarves, and it defines him as a leader who influences people but doesn't necessarily take power and take charge in Middle-earth. It lets us know a little bit of the nature of these wizards. Christopher Tolkien, who grew up at his father's knee hearing tales of Tom Bombadil and other stories, became the greatest Tolkien scholar that ever lived. And Tolkien did maintain correspondence with fans and people and publishers and all kinds of different things after the publication of Return of the King, but those letters were not published until 1981. I believe it's letter to 11 off the top of my head. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's the letter that he talked about the Astari. Christopher Tolkien, however, took various parts of some of Tolkien's writings and in 1980 published Unfinished Tales. Just like the title says, they were not finished, but there were pretty significant and interesting fragments and information that will delight or did delight fans, readers. I am not a Tolkien scholar and I am not trying to sound like one, but it is important to understand that Tolkien was writing and continually creating his world, Middle-earth. And so sometimes his ideas change. That's what made Christopher Tolkien's work so challenging and took such a long time, as he had all these notes, all these thoughts, all these ideas. And as with anyone's imagination, they were evolving. So in that letter, I'm pretty sure it's 211, Tolkien did say to whoever that was that he was pretty sure that the two wizards that were unknown failed in their quest. And that's an idea that we will watch and document changing over time. So it's a little reading from Unfinished Tales, which I'm delighted to do, but it introduces a whole bunch of new names. It introduces situations and a council of the Valar. So it gets pretty complicated, and I will end up explaining, I don't know, 5 names if I read from Unfinished Tales, so I'm not going to. But know that we get the names of these blue wizards. One is Alatar, and we're going to get a better name and a different name, but we also would encounter different names for Saruman, and it just gets too confusing. So if you want to read that, great. That's great. Go get yourself Unfinished Tales. I recommend it a lot, actually. It has a lot of things that are really interesting for Tolkien readers. I don't know that it's really important, but I feel like if I don't say it, it's a mission that in some of these tales, or in one of these tales, Saruman went with these two blue wizards into the east. And my suspicious mind says, was he already bad and did he do something with them? But that no indication that ever was Tolkien's thought, but that was mine. So by 8081, we know about these two blue, they're now blue, they're two blue wizards, and we have names, Alatar and Palando, and then we don't hear about them or from them for a long time. Meanwhile, Christopher Tolkien undertakes the History of Middle-earth project, where he takes all the notes of Tolkien and organizes them and puts, it's not a narrative, he's not creating a narrative, but he's topically going through and explaining his father's notes and thoughts and processes about creating, Middle-earth. So in that process, in one of these books, Tolkien Christopher Tolkien gets to the 12th book. And the year is 1996, so a full 16 years after Unfinished Tales, and something like 40 years after The Return of the King is published. And of course, Tolkien has passed. His wife passed. He sold the rights to The Lord of the Rings of The Hobbit. And then shortly after, he passed in November of 1973. So after his death, The Silmarillion has been published. More content has been coming out. And Christopher has been doing this magnificent History of Middle-earth series, which is probably hard to read for the average person, since it's a history of writing, often about the history of the process of writing about Middle-earth, not necessarily about Middle-earth. So, I hope I haven't put you off all that. But in 1996, Christopher publishes The Peoples of Middle-earth. And that's pretty amazing because it contains more about these wizards. It's also the 12th and final volume of the History of Middle-earth. But as we'll look at in a minute, there's an unofficial 13th volume, which, according to the dwarves and Gandalf and the Hobbit, is an unlucky number. But let's talk about the peoples of Middle-earth, and then we'll get to that. One thing that's kind of wild and unique about this Peoples of Middle-earth book is it contains some of the very last writings that Tolkien did before his passing, and especially on this topic, these were some of the very last writings in the final year of his life. So we talked earlier, I mentioned earlier about the evolution of his ideas, and he said in that letter written in the 50s that he thought these blue wizards, these two wizards, failed. But by this time, in the, no sooner than 1969, but probably later, literally in the final year of his life, perhaps in 1973, his outlook had changed about these two wizards, and he gives them some different names. So I'm just going to read from the Peoples of Middle-earth. The other two, speaking of these wizards, came much earlier, at the same time probably as Glorfindel. Sidebar, earlier Tolkien had written that they came with Saruman, but now they've come fully a huge number of years sooner with Glorfindel. Back to quoting, when matters became very dangerous in the Second Age, Glorfindel was sent to aid Elrond and was, though not yet said, preeminent in the War of Eriador. But the other two Astari, or wizards, were sent for a different purpose. Morinitar and Ramiastamo, those are the new names that are way cooler, and they also have cool meanings. Sorry I keep interrupting the reading, but I guess that's what you get. Morinitar and Ramiastamo, Darkness Slayer and East Helper, their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and after his first fall, to search out his hiding, in which they failed, and to cause, and there's a question mark here because maybe it's not clear, dissension and disarray among the Dark East. They must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who would both in the Second Age and Third Age otherwise have outnumbered the West. Close quote. That's really fascinating to me that we see a 1950s J.R.R. Tolkien writing that these wizards failed. And as he thought about his legendarium and the wizards, but the place and the events and everything that happened, he used them as a pretty viable reason why there weren't more Haradrim and other forces that overwhelmed, the smallish kingdoms of, Gondor. But anyway, it's really good. And I like it much better. I like that 1969, 70, 71, 72 thought process of J.R.R. Tolkien rather than the earlier one. It also mentions the significance, if it wasn't clear, the significance of them coming with Glorfindel instead of Saruman to the shores of Middle-earth is important as well. They're older. They had a bigger purpose. They had a different purpose. And then later, the Valar sent Gandalf and Sauron and Radagast. So I like that in two separate waves. And I, for some reason, an emotional reason, personal reason, I just feel more I just like it better that these were some of the very last, that's quote, last writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I was born in 1970, which I realize some of you, that makes me seem ancient. I seem like a spring chicken to myself, but I was alive while Tolkien was still on this earth thinking those thoughts. So I also find that pretty cool. Now then, that's a lot about the Blue Wizards. They got new names. They have a new purpose. They actually fulfilled their purpose. One of the names is the coolest thing I've ever heard. They're hard to say, but Minotaur, that darkness slayer, like how cool is that? Maybe that should be my new middle name. And Romeo Stamo, which is really hard to say. It takes a lot of practice, but that just means literally East Helper. So Tolkien was pretty on the nose about the names of those guys, but now they're cool. Now they're ancient. Now they laid the groundwork. Now they help save Middle Earth. I just like all of it better. Not without controversy. There is a Tolkien scholar of note named Karl Hostetler. I have a hard time saying his name. I don't know why. There's no tricky Tolkienness to that. But he wrote what some have called, it's called The Nature of Middle Earth, and many have called it the unofficial 13th book in the history of Middle Earth. Hostetler said that the book was a 25-year project. He is the editor, and it all started when Christopher Tolkien sent him some photocopies of what Christopher called late philological essays. So they talked about the word origins and a lot of things, but there also was a little bit about, you guessed it, since it's on this episode, some blue wizards. There's also a quote about the book from the National Review that because I like Tolkien, I want to talk him up a little bit, so I'm going to. Historian Bradley Birzer, Birzer, wrote in the National Review that this work of Hostetler cemented or confirms that Tolkien was the 20th century's greatest mythmaker, and that his mythology will, if there is any justice in the world, rank someday with that of Homer, Virgil, and Dante. Still quoting, just as Homer gave us profound insights into the Greek world, Virgil into the Roman world, and Dante into the medieval world, Tolkien gave us great insight into the modern world. Everything Tolkien wrote matters. Close quote. I am closing that quote to simply open the next quote, which is directly from the Hostetler book that he edited in Tolkien's words. Here we go. Thus it was that though, as soon as Sauron's demise was pierced and he was recognized as an enemy, he exerted all his time and strength to gathering and training armies. It took some 90 years before he felt ready to open war, and he misjudged this, as we see in his final defeat. When the great host of Minotaur from Numenor landed in Middle-earth, his gathering of armies had not been unopposed. Again, speaking of the Blue Wizards, and his success had been much less than his hope. But this is a matter spoken of in notes on the 5 wizards. That's the passage from the peoples of Middle-earth. He had powerful enemies behind his back, the east, and in the southern lands to which he had not yet given sufficient thought. Again, he is Sauron. So, Tolkien, near the end, gave these mysterious blue wizards more importance in how events happened in the story of the War of the Ring. Pretty cool. So probably a little more scholarly than I intended, but that's a look at Tolkien's takes, I should say, or his evolving take on the wizards of Middle-earth, from the publication of The Hobbit in 1937 to the publication of The Nature of Middle-earth by Karl Hostetler. Those quotes and those ideas change, and it is really remarkable. It also, again, it's not there's no story for these guys, but it gives me a better feeling of who they were and what they were. And what I think is crazy, it's the genius of Tolkien, actually, is that when he published those books in the 54 and 55, he may not have known all the details, but he knew there was more. He had this idea of this coalition of wizards who showed up looking like men, who were ancient spirits, who were not there to lead, not there to dominate, but there to help and support and inspire. And I think that's pretty freaking amazing. It's also why I think J.R.R. Tolkien is the author of the 20th century. So my name is Larry, and that is more or less the end of this episode of the Tolkien Podcast. I would ask you again, perhaps you missed it earlier, perhaps it is worth saying twice, but if you liked what you hear, if you found value here, please tell one other person about the podcast. If you want to contact me directly, if you have questions, if you have things you'd like to hear as topics, if you would like to tell me how bad my pronunciations are, you can write me at Gmail, Larry D. Curtis, no spaces, all, it doesn't matter, upper or lowercase, Larry D. Curtis at gmail.com. Short of, threatening me, you're welcome to send anything you have, any feedback, any suggestions, any requests, I'm not the guy who you can just ask Tolkien trivia. You'll stump me. I won't always get it right, but what I can do is read and look and figure it out. And if it's interesting to you, it's probably interesting to others. So if you want to leave feedback, that's great. If you know anyone who, like a book publisher who really wants to sponsor a podcast about reading Tolkien works, let me know about that too. Anyway, thanks for listening. This has been the Tolkien Podcast.